Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 225, the analysis of George Brenton McClellan. Last week, we revisited Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks. I think this is a deeper look that is necessary as a theme of some of our Redux episodes, in that battle might not have seemed like a whole lot when we went through it the first time, but here in the second time, I think we have a better appreciation of it. This week, we will look at a controversial figure, one that we've spoken about in depth before, but it is in fact George McClellan. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content, and of course, we just had a movie review. It was Rio Lobo, the John Wayne movie that actually has at least a good amount of Civil War stuff to talk about. So we kind of talked about what themes are in that movie that could be potentially historically accurate. Kind of talked about the movie, gave a little synopsis as well. So if that sounds like it would interest you, we do have other movie reviews. We've done quite a few here in our catalog on Patreon. We've done memoir reviews talking about firsthand accounts, some of the more famous ones as well, pictured slideshows of modern-day battlefields, amongst other topics. And as we get to the end of August here and move into September, I'm doing a little bit of a fantasy draft rankings when it comes to Civil War generals. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully you find that interesting. Certainly, hopefully some of you all out there have at least played, maybe currently play, or have done kind of fantasy sports and have seen similar rankings. So just wanted to do something a little bit different here for this month's Patreon as we get into this new football season. So if that sounds like it would interest you, once again, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. So far in our episodes, we have done Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson from the Confederate side, as well as for the Union, Ulysses S. Grant. Now you might think that a logical next step might be William Tecumseh Sherman. We kind of have the Batman and Robin duos for both sides to a degree. We spent probably the most time in the East talking about George B. McClellan, though, for most of a year, him being the guy for the North. As such, he is a polarizing figure. There are those who rank him a terrible general officer. This is often the case with older, conservative sources that are really drawing off of post-war narratives. It's kind of like Rosecrans and to a degree George Thomas. Grant does not like them, so they get some negative press. But in the case of George Thomas, and why he's a little bit different than, say, McClellan and Rosecrans, is that Thomas actually does see some success at Chickamauga, and then when he's commanding independently there at Franklin, he's not really too involved with the Battle of Franklin, but Nashville is a huge victory, a huge one-sided victory for the North, so he's able to stave off this negative press that otherwise he might have received from Grant. Not many people liked McClellan, so that is where we have some issues. Edwin Stanton hated him. You can tell by the end Lincoln is really fed up with his nonsense as well. It's possible we've actually read before Lincoln's letter to McClellan after Antietam, but you really get the tone that he's sort of tired of everything. If he should move northward, I would follow him closely, holding his communications. If he should prevent our seizing his communications and move toward Richmond, I would press closely to him, fight him if a favorable opportunity should present, and at least try to beat him to Richmond on the inside track. I say try. If we never try, we shall never succeed. If he makes a stand at Winchester, moving neither north nor south, I would fight him there, on the idea that if we cannot beat him when he bears the wastage of coming to us, we never can when we bear the wastage of going to him. This proposition is a simple truth, and is too important to be lost sight of for a moment. In coming to us, he tenders us an advantage which we should have not waived. We should not so operate as to merely drive him away. As we must beat him somewhere, or fail finally, we can do it, if at all, easier near to us than far away. If we cannot beat the enemy where he is now, we never can. He again being within the entrenchments of Richmond. So yeah, you get the idea that Lincoln's like, hey, why don't you just do something, right? Like, he's giving him these very broad strokes of like, hey, depending on where he's going. And this is another reason why I think Lincoln is a admirable president, and that he doesn't really have a whole lot of military know-how when he comes into office. Obviously, he had served as a militiaman during the Black Hawk War, so he has at least a little bit of that. But obviously, he's never really been an officer, and he's never had to make these kinds of decisions. But he does a pretty good job of sitting there and saying, well, let's kind of look at it logically. Like, he has all these options that are available to him, Robert E. Lee does. And so following Antietam, which was, again, it's a lot of casualties, the single greatest number of casualties on a single day, right? But you still have this army that has a good amount of men who were not actually engaged, or at least not heavily engaged during the action. Robert E. Lee has suffered pretty heavily. He came into the fight with not nearly as men as McClellan thought he did. So then Lincoln says, hey, why don't we do something other than just sitting where we are? And that really you get the tone of how he's sort of fed up with McClellan by this point. Grant does not get talked to quite the same. And we can probably think that part is Lincoln has sort of found his guy by that point. But I think Little Mac's record deserves a deeper dive. Where did it all go wrong? In my mind, he gets a pretty clear victory at Antietam, and yet he does not get as much credit. When we talk about these battles and we go through these analysis episodes, in certain cases so far, you really don't get the same kind of treatment that McClellan is getting in this particular Battle of Antietam. You kind of have these classics, right? Like Ulysses S. Grant and Lee have this kind of aura about them. They operate on this kind of higher plane. Not a person, but something beyond that. Stonewall Jackson is very much the same. You can think some of these lost cause narratives for that, and that they're saying he's a martyr for the lost cause. When you take a look at his actual battlefield performances, it might surprise you to note that he does not really sparkle all the time. That is where we get to the other end of the opinion, which is that McClellan was not so bad. I find it very rare that somebody is 100% McClellan was awesome, and to be fair, it might be hard to take that stance. But there is enough evidence, I believe, to throw out that he was not the detrimental commander he is sometimes portrayed as. In other words, I believe he's fine. By now, you should know I love my what-if scenarios, and one big one I have thrown out there a couple of times is what if Grant has the Army of the Potomac during the time frame McClellan has it? Is the result really at all much different? We can maybe take a look at his entire performance and then make a judgment call. McClellan was born in 1826 in Philadelphia. His father was a surgeon, and originally George would be angling to follow his father into that profession. He would attend the University of Pennsylvania and switch to law before an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. While at the academy, he would be a solid student of Dennis Hart Mahan, whom we've talked about before. He would graduate at just 19, second in his class, and obtain an appointment to the engineers, which is really where you wanted to go if you were tops in your class back then. Remember, too, he's part of that famous class that also includes Stonewall Jackson. He would serve in Mexico, first with Zachary Taylor, and then amongst the staff of Winfield Scott. McClellan would scout for Scott in the same way as Beauregard and Lee. Like many other officers, he would become irritated by volunteers and non-professional officers. This is going to really carry over into the Civil War, with McClellan really wanting to curate his subordinates, and thus creating a lot of officers who had their patronage to him, so to speak. After the war, he would spend some time out west surveying. He would be on an expedition to find the Red River source, and then on a special assignment to begin planning out a route for a transcontinental railroad. It was on one of these expeditions that he refused to turn over his personal notes because of his personal comments. Keep that one in mind as we move forward, because he is going to have a lot of personal comments that, if you kept private, would probably be fine. However, since they're published and they're in history books, might not be quite so great. He would be sent on another special assignment to look at the defenses of Santo Domingo by Jefferson Davis. McClellan would learn French and translate a bayonet tactic manual. Because of this, he would also be sent to Crimea to observe the conflict there, McClellan would design a cavalry saddle that would be widely used during the Civil War. Resigning his commission, he would go into railroads, relying on his previous experience. It's during this time when he's going into railroads, he would actually be partnering up with a guy named Ambrose Burnside, who was one of these guys who is going to eventually have his kind of patronage toward McClellan, so to speak. He had married his wife Ellen in 1860 and would go into politics as a Democrat, something else also to keep in mind. Ellen and George would have 2 children, but neither would have children of their own. As the war broke out, he would find himself commanding the Department of Ohio. He had been informally approached to actually serve for the Confederacy, as he was by no means an abolitionist, but he was very much against the severing of the Union. We have a lot of individuals who are kind of like that, right? We have like William T. Sherman is one. There's a lot of individuals who are serving in the South. There's a lot of individuals who do not think politically, who maybe even dislike the Republicans, who are going to just side with the fact that we need to keep the federal government together. From Ohio, he would start to build up his forces, eventually obtaining the rank of Major General. His plan would include an invasion of Virginia through the western part of the state, or the invasion of Kentucky and Tennessee with a large number of troops. Winfield Scott, who we have talked about before, was not really interested in pressing the issue this early in the war, so he would decline this option. There's a lot of individuals who, I think when we went over our first Manassas episode, kind of point to Winfield Scott and how certainly he is not physically able to command in the field anymore. He's pretty overweight by this point. He's a little bit older. But then also, he's not really mentally able to prosecute the war to the degree that maybe it should have been in this early part. Like, if you had McClellan marching through the western part of Virginia or maybe into Tennessee, Kentucky, that's probably a more interesting way that you would see the Confederate forces respond. Whereas, you do have this kind of limited army under Irvin McDowell that has to move, and they're really the only show in town, so to speak, right? Like, they're the only ones who are going to be operating. So you do have a lot of kind of rumblings to that effect. As it was, McClellan would move into pro-Union West Virginia with troops, engaging in the first land battle at Philippi, then launching a successful flank maneuver at Rich Mountain. William S. Rosecrans would have received the credit for Rich Mountain, but Little Mac would take it all, and he might not have been on the field at Philippi at all. McClellan had been really ready to call off Rosecrans, which highlights his timidity. As you might be saying here, thinking like Rich Mountain, if you think all the way back to that in our early episodes, it was a pretty aggressive move. Like, it's kind of like a flank attack. It's, part of it is in the dark at night. So, doesn't really sound like McClellan, does it? As it was, Rosecrans would not get the order and would hit the troops under future Confederate General John Pegram, removing them from their good defensive position. Therefore, in a weird way, it would seem that McClellan was the right type of aggressive in these battles. Regardless, these were 2 early wins for the Union. Remember that Lincoln would place a special emphasis on West Virginia and East Tennessee, these being 2 largely pro-Union areas traditionally of the South. Despite there being continued action in this mountainous region, McClellan would ensure that the territory stays in the hands of the North for the remainder of the war. He would do a good job in building up the Army of the Potomac and making it into an effective fighting force once he arrives in Washington. I think that the actual correspondence to get McClellan, we've read that before, where they're getting him to Washington. It really kind of puts a lot of pressure on him. It really kind of emphasizes this kind of savior narrative that he's going to start to write for himself, because they're like, wow, we need you right now to get here as fast as possible and begin right away, right? So there is fault all around the board, if you will, about whether McClellan is just really this kind of egomaniac. And I think that's partially true, but also I think there are individuals who stoke that ego and individuals who will turn their tune pretty quickly when they realize that maybe this guy isn't all that. Remember that in this early period, he would have a mutiny to put down by a New York regiment, so he would mix between having a heavy hand but also providing much needed supply and organization to the troops. He really does create the Army of the Potomac. He is a good organizer, so he is able to put it together and drill it and train it into what will become an effective fighting force, certainly a more effective fighting force than Irvin McDowell had. In the process, he would almost immediately bump heads with everyone. He would, in November of 1861, become Commander-in-Chief of the Federal Forces, replacing Winfield Scott. Scott had been disagreeing with him since the Department of the Ohio. What was more was that the Republicans would wish for McClellan to do something. Really anything. With such a large army being formed up, it would seem that the time was good in the fall of 1861 to begin some kind of offensive. Despite the green nature of the troops, we should also understand that the Confederate infantry was still in Northern Virginia. There was at least some movement abroad. The fact that Joseph Johnston was still very close to a striking distance to Washington was a hard pill to swallow. In a lot of our narrative episodes, we have talked about the Confederate strategy, and in many ways I think we almost put more emphasis on the strategy than really mention the Union one, because the Union one is pretty simple, right? The Confederates are taking this kind of offensive defensive strategy. They're trying to maintain their territory. At least Jefferson Davis wants to do that, wants to hold on to these southern states and keep them happy. And, obviously if you're acting on the defensive, it becomes kind of easier. Whereas if you are the Union, you need to actually act offensively, because you're trying to get all these states to come back into the Union, and you're really just not going to do that if you're just sitting in the outskirts of Washington. While that's happening, though, there is going to be some action by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, who are going to strike at a stand-in for the young Napoleon in Charles Pomeroy Stone, whose action at Ball's Bluff was sort of a disaster. The patience of Abraham Lincoln was also starting to wear pretty thin. But McClellan was going to try to come up with a plan. He's going to toy at getting at Johnson, his seemingly strong defensive position near Centerville deemed not good for frontal assault. Thus we had the Urbana Plan, which was foiled by a withdrawal of Johnson, where he had to shift to focusing on the peninsula. In the meantime, we have Little Mac being removed from his duties as Commander-in-Chief, it being decided that he would probably be better off just watching over the primary field army. This is when we have Henry Halleck, Old Brains, showing up shortly to take the administrative control in Washington. Little Mac would also lose the fight over just having divisions, the army switching up to the corps system. Abraham Lincoln is actually going to intervene in this case, and McClellan having to be in control of several divisions would have been an interesting concept, but also not one that Abe was wanting to play out at the gates of Richmond. Initially on the peninsula, McClellan would show some aggression. He would be stopped by John Bacon Magruder with his warlike line anchored at Yorktown. McClellan had experienced siege when he observed the Crimea, and was ready to do so again, except that Johnson was not willing to let him. Falling on the rear guard at Williamsburg, the young Napoleon would see the first real battle of this main theater. Fair Oaks would follow, George B. being affected by the larger casualty counts of these two early engagements. Wanting to not wage a harder war and not waste the lives of his men, he would seek to maybe force a withdrawal of the rebel troops. Unlucky for him, though, Robert E. Lee was now taking the reins, as opposed to Johnson, who might have given him the opportunity to snag Richmond, matching Halleck's relatively bloodless taking of Corinth. Advancing to the gates of Richmond, there would be a pause. A naval attempt to get up the James would be thwarted, and Johnson would launch his famous ride, exposing the flaw in McClellan's army, his open flank. Irvin McDowell had been supposed to be released to join McClellan, however he would not, remaining at Fredericksburg to check any Confederate attempt at the capital. Lee is thus going to be free to launch his 7 days battles, sort of copying off Johnson's plan to hit an isolated part of the Union Army, this time being the 5th Corps at Mechanicsville, then at Gaines's Mill, where the rebels chalk up a much-needed W. McClellan would start to pull the army back, sort of seemingly at a loss for what to do. This is going to result in a running fight, Savage's Station, and then at Glendale, and finally having to take a defensive position at Malvern Hill, where he does get the best of Lee and keep his army alive. McClellan's role in these battles, though, would vary, and his presence was definitely not really felt. It was rumored he had jumped aboard a gunboat to save himself rather than command the army at Malvern Hill. Glendale was almost a huge disaster. It's one of those battles that we might go back and redo, in that it was a key crossroad, and had the Confederates been able to control it, might have been able to slice the army into pieces. And then again, you have Malvern Hill, which really, if we're looking at it from a Confederate perspective, is the least well thought out plan, but there is still some opportunity for some success for them. So there is not really gold stars for anyone in any of these battles, and certainly not for McClellan, not for Jackson and Lee, as we've talked about before. Pulling back, there the forces would sit at Harrison's Landing. Here is where the plan to maybe get at Petersburg would start to be hatched, but Little Mackin and Dean wore out the patience of Lincoln at long last. John Pope would form the primary army leader now, the Army of the Potomac forces being sent to reinforce him as he would attempt an overland route to get at the Confederates. This is not to say McClellan was entirely idle. He would press toward Malvern Hill at one point, reoccupying the same ground, but little would come of it. Timidity had gotten the better of him. Constantly, he would overestimate the amount of enemy combatants, and this is not going to be helped by Lee's aggressive nature in these battles. So we have McClellan temporarily sidelined. What we can say is that Lee does not necessarily walk all over him. He is aggressive and he comes out better in the 7 days battles. However, McClellan is able to at least put on okay performances during the 7 days. However, we can also kind of point to the fact that he does not get routed the way John Pope does. But in an interesting twist, we can also probably argue that George B. McClellan is also a big reason that John Pope gets routed, in that he is not sending any kind of forces to the north in a hurry, right? Remember, we have kind of the remnants of this Valley Army that are kind of being cobbled together. Irvin McDowell is forming this nucleus for John Pope and his Army of Virginia. And then you have the Army of the Potomac, who is going to provide resources as well. Well, McClellan's going to kind of drag his feet in terms of sending troops north, whereas Pope is going to meet setback at Cedar Mountain. You know, it's pretty important that Jackson actually hits him at Cedar Mountain, because that's going to stop his advance. And then it's going to allow the Confederates to take the momentum, and they're going to be able to take the battle to Pope. And Pope is not going to be the best battlefield leader, as we will see during Second Manassas. Now, had he had more troops, maybe it would have been different, but his army does almost get routed, right? At first, he is unable to find Jackson, then he stumbles upon him, then he's going to attack the railroad cut, and then Longstreet's going to show up and flank him. And then if it's not for some troops that are going to arrive and kind of stave off this total defeat, there is going to be a potential for disaster there. It might have actually been Lee's greatest victory, Second Manassas, had there been a total rout of the army, and maybe even destruction, right? We've talked about that before, how in Napoleonic eras, times, there is kind of like a complete destruction of armies. That's a concept that happens, whereas in the Civil War, we just don't have that. We have very limited examples of that. It's always something that you're holding your cavalry for. It's the Napoleonic tactic. The cavalry is going to wait, and then once the enemy is running away, the cavalry is going to finish the job, so to speak, whether they're going to kill or capture the remaining of these men as they're running away. Obviously, if you see in the movie The Patriot, you also know that tactic as well, because that's what the bad guy does, So you have that too. And so that's a real tactic that would have happened in Napoleon times. Doesn't really happen in Civil War times. With Lee turning his attention to Maryland, though, it was time to return Little Mac to the helm. Now, this is going to be more out of necessity than anything else. McClellan had been familiar with leading an army, which was what was going to be necessary given the collapsed timeline. Getting someone acclimated into the position would take time, and time was not something that Lincoln had. Fortunately for McClellan, he would receive Lee's plan of battle due to an extra set of orders that had been discarded. He would know exactly where all of the Confederates were and strike at South Mountain, carrying 3 passes and forcing Lee to be on the back foot, Lee setting up at Sharpsburg. Now, had McClellan been entirely aggressive, right? This is a big criticism of him in the Antietam campaign, right? He does have the plan. He does know where all of Lee's troops are. But once he is able to successfully win at South Mountain, with South Mountain might have been his best battle in terms of strategy and being able to carry these positions and realizing that in a lot of cases, the Confederates kind of had a shell defense. Well, once he's able to breach South Mountain, then it's like, oh, well, I mean, the plans are over. It's like, I still don't know where everyone is, right? Whereas you could probably safely assume that Jackson's not getting there in time. A.P. Hill is going to be behind him, having to deal with Harper's Ferry. There's other units that have not yet arrived to Lee's army. So if he had been able to strike quickly, then he might have been able to defeat the Confederates piecemeal, or a more aggressive general might have been able to. But again, you see kind of this linear thinking of him where he's like, all right, we have these plans, we're going to be able to execute. And then once that happens, you're not able to adjust on the fly. It's like, well, we have to actually come up with a new plan now. And that plan is going to eventually be what becomes the Battle of Antietam. Now, it should be said, too, that McClellan is going to be on the offensive when Antietam opens up. While many can be critical of McClellan for having a corps not engaged, it's sort of fitting to his orders to defend Washington. If he had committed all of his troops and lost, then he might have had a bigger problem on his hands. As it was, Lee was pretty heavily outnumbered, and he would have to withdraw following the battle. Now, that's another thing that we can also point out, too, is that Lee does actually have some pretty strong defensive positions. You could actually argue, if you've ever been to the Bloody Lane, that maybe that wasn't the best defensive position, right? Because it was at the bottom of a hill. But at the same time, you can have some pretty good defensive positions. There's pretty good plans of attack, whether that's responding to what's happening at the cornfield, where we have the West Woods, and then Sunken Road, we have to respond to that, and then Burnside's Bridge. We talked about that, or we'll talk about that actually in a future episode, where we will go more in depth on what happens there and why it's important. There is also a lot of people that point to the fact that the 5th Corps never really gets into the action. I've seen actually accounts and more modern takes on Antietam that have shown that they do actually advance to the field, and there's rumors that McClellan never really makes it close to the battlefield, but he really only gets out there like once or twice. I don't really think that that's a huge argument to make, whether the guy's there one time or no times at all and he can't see the battlefield from his headquarters, right? Sure, okay, like that's, I don't necessarily see that as an argument for or against the guy, but the fact that the 5th Corps was at least deployed for part of the battle and they do advance a little bit before withdrawing, that kind of goes against the grain of what's usually kind of the canon of Antietam, and that's that the 5th Corps entirely and his buddy Fitzjohn Porter, right? Fitzjohn Porter is actually going to get his comeuppance at his court-martial following 2nd Manassas. That's another guy who owes McClellan his job, where Fitzjohn Porter is not going to actually get his troops into the combat. McClellan will give a half-hearted chase of Lee as he escapes back into Virginia. While importantly he had won at Antietam, Lincoln realized exactly what he was getting with the young Napoleon. Here we have Lincoln's letter to McClellan following Antietam. My dear sir, you remember my speaking to you of what I called your overcautiousness. Are you not overcautious when you assume that you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing? Should you not claim to be at least his equal in prowess and act upon the claim? As I understand you, telegraph General Halleck that you cannot subsist your army at Winchester unless the railroad from Harper's Ferry to that point be put in working order. But the enemy does now subsist his army at Winchester at a distance nearly twice as great from the railroad transportation as you would have to do without the railroad last named. He now has wagons from Culpeper Courthouse, which is just about twice as far as you would have from Harper's Ferry. He is certainly not more than half as well provided with wagons as you are. I certainly should be pleased for you to have an advantage of the railroad from Harper's Ferry to Winchester, but it wastes all the remainder of autumn to give it to you, and in fact ignores the question of time, which cannot and must not be ignored. Again, one of the standard maxims of war, as you know, is to operate upon the enemy's communications as much as possible without exposing your own. You seem to act as if this applies against you, but cannot apply in your favor. Change positions with the enemy, and think not he would break your communication with Richmond within the next 24 hours? You dread his going into Pennsylvania, but if he does so in full force, he gives up his communications to you absolutely, and you have nothing to do but to follow and ruin him. If he does so with less than full force, fall upon and beat him, what is left behind all the easier. Exclusive of the water line, you are now nearer Richmond than the enemy is by the route that you can, and he must take. Why can you not reach there before him unless you admit that he is more than your equal on the march? His route is the arc of a circle, while yours is the chord. The roads that he is on now are as good as yours. You know I desired, but did not order, you to cross the Potomac, below instead of above, the Shenandoah and the Blue Ridge. My idea was this would at once menace the enemy's communications, which I would seize if he would permit. So there we go. We have Lincoln's letter that's really going to be calling out McClellan. McClellan's going to give a whole bunch of excuses. He's going to be talking about how his cavalry doesn't have horses, and then Jeb Stuart's going to ride around his army, and Lincoln's going to send another one that's like, well, it seems like the Confederate horses are fine. I don't know what you're talking about, how you need horses, because theirs are just fine enough to ride around your army and escape. Where here you have McClellan. In many ways, actually, it's kind of interesting. This letter kind of reads sort of like if you ever have read the famous letter that the Zaporozhian Cossacks send to who I think it would be the Persian Sultan at the time, or maybe the Ottoman Sultan. I can't remember. They're sending a letter to him, and it's a huge comical letter of kind of making fun of the first one that they received for them to kind of submit to him. And it goes that, you know, the time is the same time here as is there, and we don't own a watch, so we don't really know what time it is, because the first letter has this huge kind of talk about how it's the time of this day and that and this and the other thing. So in many ways, Lincoln's letter kind of is reminiscent of that a little bit, where it's like, well, are you saying that you're like not as good as you've been saying you are? Like you can't match him? You know, Lincoln does have, I will say this, especially during the Valley campaign, he has a hard time with really understanding the terrain on the ground, which is a problem, right? When you're trying to send John C. Fremont's army from point A to point B, except there's a mountain in the way, and it's not really as easy as just getting there, and the road conditions aren't good. So he might be mistaken in that sense, where McClellan could just march on Richmond, and it would be kind of easy going, right? And Lee wouldn't be able to hit him on the way, or even has a possibility of beating him, right? There is kind of a weird thought process with that, but it's in some ways you kind of get the frustration piece of Abraham Lincoln, where he's saying, you at least try this, right? Like maybe this is an idea, maybe it's trying to inspire him, but you really get the attitude in this letter. Little Mac would get his final termination on November 5th in the favor of Burnside. Burnside was quite reluctant to take over, given that he was taking over for his friend. However, when he was told that the alternative was Joe Hooker, can't stand Hooker, so he's going to take the job. Remember, there had been another riding of Jeb Stuart and some skirmishing and maneuvering getting back into Virginia, but that was going to be it for his military career. We have covered, in part, the immediate aftermath for McClellan. He would be ordered to his home in New Jersey to await further orders. At times, there would be calls for him to return to lead his forces, but he was done leading troops in the field. And you kind of get why, right? Like, I think we did a pretty good job of reading some of these correspondences from Lincoln, and like there are very similar kind of quotes from members of the Army, from Edwin Stanton as well, where they're just kind of through with McClellan. There's really no avenue for him to come back when there's all these attitudes about him. McClellan, though, was not done with our narrative story, as he would obtain the Democratic nomination for president in the 1864 election, but would be rather soundly defeated by Abraham Lincoln. He would spend some time abroad post-war, getting back into railroads, and then another stint in Europe. He would become the 24th governor of New Jersey, winning the 1877 election for that state. It is hardly a surprise that McClellan's tenure as governor would be marked with conservatism. His political ambition would really go no further, toying with maybe serving as a Secretary of War under Grover Cleveland, but being unsuccessful in that attempt. Retiring again, he would work on his memoirs. George B. McClellan would die unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1885. So why exactly do we have this negative perception of Little Mac? Part of the problem with McClellan is that he talks a lot of smack. That is apparent in his writings to his wife Ellen. Now, who amongst us has never complained about a coworker? I'll invite that person to step forward and cast the first stone. I'm sure we've all talked about, or maybe had thoughts about, a coworker that maybe they weren't really particularly good at their job, or we didn't like them for some reason, or they were hard to get along with, what have you. But a lot of us probably don't write these things down. And then have those things that we wrote down put into books. And then the books that throw these correspondences out and say, wow, look at this. We have a big example of the kind of thing that can get you negative press in the following excerpt. To Mary Ellen McClellan. I can't tell you how disgusted I am in becoming with these wretched politicians. They are a most despicable set of men, and I think Seward is the meanest of them all meddling. officious, incompetent little puppy, he has done more than any other man to bring all this misery upon the country, and is one of the least competent to get us out of that scrap. The president is nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. Wells is weaker than the most scurrilous old woman you were ever annoyed by. Bates is a good, inoffensive old man, so this goes only to keep these complimentary opinions to yourself, or you may get me into premature trouble. I believe I have choked off Seward already, and have strong hopes that he will keep himself to his own business hereafter. So yeah, when you call your boss a baboon, then that is going to be a problem, right? Especially when that is written down and you can see it in history books and you can read about it afterwards, right? Now, maybe you cannot blame McClellan for his much talking of trash. I think it should be pointed out that a lot of fanfare surrounded him. Talked about that here at the top of the episode. McClellan writes about how he is the savior of the Union when he first takes over. Lincoln and Scott are bowing before him, seemingly. He gets his monikers of the young Napoleon. Remember, Napoleon is like the Michael Jordan for these guys, so being compared to him is kind of a big deal. Part of that allure is that he is fitting of the description of an outstanding general. Looking the part, he gets good press. He takes over after getting some W's. McDowell had taken a huge first loss at First Manassas, so getting a somewhat known commodity was refreshing to the public. Unlike other generals in our story, though, he comes from a pretty privileged background. He has his opportunity, and while maybe not completely botching it, he certainly does not take full advantage of it. That, I think, is why we generally have a tougher reception for him. It's easy to root for the underdogs. When they succeed, it's a good story. Not that McClellan was super rich, but when the rich kid fails, we kind of seem to enjoy that more. Remember all your childhood and teen movies, and you will probably see how the rich people are usually the bad guys. And again, while McClellan is not incredibly well off, he does come from above the poverty and failure that you probably see from someone like Grant and Sherman. Like, yeah, you could see McClellan as being the skier who's trying to take over the mountain resort, and his dad's trying to sell it and make it private, and all the snowboarders are mad at him. Yeah, you could probably see that. It's probably a good comparison. Can we also say that he does have a say in his own success in life? Absolutely, he should not be seen as some kind of nepo baby. But he does get certain things handed to him, and that again is where I think the popular anti-McClellan take comes from. We talked about the famous class in which he is in West Point, and how he has a lot of advantages when he comes in. He already has the stellar education. He can speak French. Guys like Stonewall Jackson, they don't have that advantage. So when you're able to be given all this opportunity, and then you kind of don't really do anything with it, even though you could probably go back and argue that McClellan has a pretty successful career had the Civil War not happened, right? He invents the saddle. He's successful in railroads. He does serve in the Mexican-American War. He does a good job there. He does some surveying. So there's a lot of things that he does that are actually pretty successful leading up to the war. But I think that's also the problem, is that he was successful. So you kind of continue to expect him, given all that opportunity, continue to expect that success. But what should our conclusion of McClellan be? Interestingly, he has the same idea that Grant's going to have in 1864, and unlike Grant, McClellan's not going to allow for an enemy to press the capital. Right? Could you even imagine if Lincoln had had a Confederate force sitting at his doorstep when McClellan is acting on the peninsula? Like it just wouldn't have happened, right? Whereas that exact thing happens in 1864 when Grant is actually leading the charge on Richmond, right? Like it's such kind of like an interesting parallel. We're going to get into it a little bit more actually in our sub-episode, but McClellan definitely is a victim of the time frame in which he takes command. He obviously does not play things well in terms of his relationships, but he is still commanding at a time when the loss of Washington would be terrible, and the Confederates in Virginia are going to put together probably one of the better fighting forces they have during the war. It is not entirely outside the realm of possibility that the Confederates could check him and then press north. He has the Petersburg idea super early in the conflict. Grant has this idea and it is seen as kind of a defeat or a failure. Ultimately, this is what works in 1864 into 1865. But would it have worked in 1862? Maybe not, for the already mentioned reason that the rebels will have more troops to act offensively with. And certainly, if they're being relocated to Petersburg, then also that's probably going to still seem as a kind of defeat. Change of base is always the kind of phrasing that we use with McClellan, where he says we're going to have a change of base, and that's kind of like a fancy way for him to say we're having a retreat. Well, that change of base to Petersburg, even though it might have seemed like a retreat, again, that's actually part of the winning formula later in the war. Now, things are actually pretty different. We should also say that. Whereas there's less Confederate troops, there's less capable officers for Lee. Lee's not going to be as willing to divide up his army against Grant, except in the case of sending early north. And there's really no chance of that actually really succeeding, as we've talked about before. But you get an idea of how just the situation had changed. Remember, too, that no Union general wants to be in charge of the next 1st Manassas. This is certainly on his mind, whereas Grant, for instance, kind of just gets a pass to do whatever he wants, even jeopardize Washington. Like he's irritated, he has to even send the 6th Corps to deal with Early in 64. Does McClellan need McDowell? In order for him to act offensively, he probably does not really need McDowell, right? We've talked about before how he has enough troops in his army to really press the issue there prior to the 7 days. But the difference in my mind, I think, is that if Grant had requested that McDowell join his army, then he probably would have gotten him. Now, there should be something said about the growth of Abraham Lincoln as a president, as a commander-in-chief, and his judgment of character. I think overall the negative perception of McClellan continues to antedum. It is argued that he is primed to act offensively, and he does so at South Mountain. He does a good job of engaging the enemy, and while he does not have a huge numerical advantage, the primary goal is still accomplished. Lee wintering in Maryland or Pennsylvania was the rebel goal, mind you, so getting them out of the northern soil would be hugely important. Does he follow up on that with success? Not really. In fact, he delays pretty heavily, eventually being removed. You could also point out that he had just fought a battle with the single greatest amount of casualties, as we mentioned, so there is that to point to. The point is, though, is that while I'm not in the camp fully of McClellan, I don't think that really there could have been a whole lot done differently in some of these cases. I can at least understand his thought process in certain instances. If the 5th Corps goes in and there is no more sizable force to protect Washington, then that's a problem, and he gets probably rightfully so blamed as kind of the loser in the situation. Lee had operated with more men in previous campaigns, while attrition had taken its toll. It was not without possibility that he would not receive reinforcements. The counter to that is that George B. does have a copy of Lee's orders, and he has a very strong idea of what the goal is going to be at Antietam. In his mind, he's going to accomplish that, and that's not going to include a pursuit. I have seen it pointed out that the main issue of McClellan is that he's incapable of thinking in a nonlinear form. He has a plan, we need to stick to it, and there's going to be no deviation. I tend to agree with this. The bigger picture is the total destruction of Lee's army. The plan was to get him out of Maryland. While understandable, we could see how it is frustrating for the president. He is able to build the Army of the Potomac into an aggressive fighting force. That's very true. And that, besides the battle there at Sharpsburg, could be the greatest contribution that he gives to the war effort. Overall, though, I'm not sure if we've really answered any questions, as he's still quite a complicated figure. So we have our full rundown of McClellan. Again, hopefully it's easier to have these more focused episodes on the entirety of our time in the war to get a good picture. Next time we're going to check in on an event that actually we missed in the main narrative. We're going to be talking about George Stoneman's raid of 1865. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website and Patreon. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.